September 26, 1983. The Cold War was at one of its most dangerous moments. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in a struggle unlike any the world had ever seen. It was not a war fought with tanks crossing borders. It was not a war fought with soldiers storming beaches. It was a war of fear, a war of spies, a war of nuclear weapons. And on that night, the entire world came closer to destruction than almost anyone realized. Most people were asleep. Families across America were resting in their homes. Children slept peacefully in their beds. Across Europe, cities were quiet. Even inside the Soviet Union, millions of ordinary citizens had no idea how close they were to catastrophe. But deep inside a secret Soviet military facility, one man stared at a computer screen that was about to change history. His name was Stanislav Petrov. At the time, Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. His job carried enormous responsibility. He worked at a highly classified early warning center responsible for detecting possible nuclear attacks from the United States. The facility monitored satellites positioned above Earth. These satellites were designed to identify missile launches almost immediately after they occurred. If American nuclear missiles were launched, the system would detect them. The Soviet leadership would then have only minutes to decide how to respond, and that response would almost certainly involve launching thousands of nuclear weapons of their own. Mutually assured destruction. Mad. That was the terrifying logic of the Cold War. If one side attacked, the other side would strike back. The result would be unimaginable devastation. Entire cities erased, millions dead within hours, perhaps hundreds of millions. By 1983, tensions between the two superpowers had reached alarming levels. Just weeks earlier, Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it accidentally entered Soviet airspace. All 269 people aboard were killed. The incident shocked the world. Relations between Moscow and Washington deteriorated rapidly. Soviet leaders feared the United States was becoming increasingly aggressive. American leaders feared Soviet expansion. Trust was virtually non-existent. Both sides expected the worst from each other. And in that atmosphere of fear and suspicion, mistakes became incredibly dangerous. Petrov knew all of this. Every officer in the facility knew it. They understood that if the warning system ever detected an American launch, they would have only moments to act. There would be no time for long debates, no time for detailed investigations, only decisions, fast decisions, potentially world-ending decisions. That night seemed routine. Petrov had reported for duty like countless times before. The monitors glowed softly in the dark control room. Officers watched screens. Technicians reviewed data. Nothing appeared unusual. Everything seemed calm. But shortly after midnight, the silence was shattered. Without warning, alarms exploded throughout the facility. Bright lights flashed. Warning indicators lit up across multiple screens. The system had detected something terrifying. According to the computers, the United States had just launched a nuclear missile toward the Soviet Union. For a moment, nobody moved. The room froze. The alarm continued screaming. The computer system displayed its conclusion. Missile launch detected. The nightmare scenario had arrived. And according to Soviet protocol, there was only one thing Petrov was supposed to do: immediately report the attack up the chain of command. But as he stared at the screen, something didn't feel right. Something about the situation bothered him. Something that would soon place the fate of the world in his hands. And within minutes, Stanislav Petrov would face one of the most important decisions in human history. The alarm continued to echo through the command center. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every person in that room understood exactly what the warning meant. If the computer was correct, a nuclear missile was already on its way. There was no opportunity to stop it. No chance to intercept it. No way to negotiate. Only time to decide how the Soviet Union would respond. Petrov immediately focused on the information appearing across the screens. The warning system was known as OKO, a sophisticated network of satellites. to detect the heat signatures produced by missile launches. It represented one of the Soviet Union's most advanced military technologies. The system was supposed to provide precious minutes of warning in the event. American first strike, and according to OCO, that strike had begun. The display indicated that a missile had been launched from the United States. The system classified the alert with its highest confidence level. Not possible. Petrov stared at the data. Around him, other officers waited for instructions. Protocol demanded immediate action. His superiors needed to know. The Soviet military command needed to know. The Kremlin needed to know. But before Petrov could fully process the information, the alarm sounded again. Another missile. The screen updated. Then another. And another. And another. Within moments, the system was reporting 5 incoming American nuclear missiles. 5. The tension inside the room became almost unbearable. The officers watched the screens in silence. Some later recalled feeling certain that war had begun. Others focused entirely on their tasks, attempting to suppress fear and follow procedure. Petrov knew what would happen if he officially reported the alert as an attack. The information would rapidly move through multiple levels of command. Senior Soviet leaders would be informed. Military commanders would evaluate retaliation options. And because nuclear missiles travel incredibly fast, there would be only available to make decisions. Minutes. That was all. The terrifying reality of nuclear warfare is that leaders cannot wait for certainty. If they wait too long, their own weapons may be destroyed before they can launch them. That was the logic behind the entire Cold War, and that logic now rested on Petrov's shoulders. Yet despite the alarms, despite the flashing warnings, despite the pressure, something continued to bother him. The situation simply didn't make sense. If the United States truly intended to launch a nuclear-first strike against the Soviet Union, why would they launch only 5 missiles? Petrov knew American nuclear strategy. He understood military doctrine. A real first strike would likely involve hundreds of missiles, possibly thousands. The goal would be to overwhelm Soviet defenses and eliminate their ability to respond. 5 missiles made little strategic sense. Why would the Americans risk global nuclear war with such a small attack? The more he thought about it, the less convincing the warning appeared. But there was another problem. The satellite system was new. Much of its technology had never been tested under real-world conditions. No one knew with complete certainty how reliable it was. Petrov later admitted that he did not fully trust the system, not because it was poorly designed, but because it had not existed long enough to prove itself. The computers were saying one thing. His instincts were saying another. And every second that passed increased the pressure. He looked for confirmation from other sources. Normally, ground-based radar systems would eventually detect incoming missiles. But there was a problem. The missiles were supposedly still too far away. The radars couldn't confirm anything yet. At that moment, the satellites were the only source of information. The room grew quieter. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Petrov, waiting for the man in charge to make a decision, waiting for someone to tell them whether World War III had just begun. Petrov understood the consequences of being wrong. If he ignored a real attack, millions could die. The Soviet Union could be devastated. His own country might be destroyed. But if he reported a false alarm as a real attack, he could trigger a chain reaction that might end civilization itself. There was no safe choice, no obvious answer, only uncertainty. And the clock was ticking. For a brief moment, Petrov found himself facing a question that no human being should ever have to answer. Could he trust the machines, or should he trust his own judgment? The fate of nations now depended on which choice he made next. The room waited. The alarms continued to scream. Bright warning lights flashed across the control panels. Every officer in the bunker understood that history was unfolding in real time. And all eyes were on Stanislav Petrov. According to Soviet procedure, his duty was clear. Report the attack immediately. Pass the information to his superiors. Allow the military command structure to do the rest. Simple, at least on paper. But Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. The scenario didn't make sense. 5 missiles? That was all? The United States possessed thousands of nuclear weapons. If Washington truly intended to destroy the Soviet Union, why launch only 5? Why risk a retaliatory strike that would destroy American cities? The logic simply wasn't there. Petrov later explained that he found the warning suspicious almost immediately. His training told him that a genuine first strike would likely involve a massive launch. not a handful of missiles, not something so limited. Yet the computer system remained confident, very confident. The screens continued displaying the same terrifying conclusion. Nuclear attack detected! At that moment, Petrov faced a dilemma unlike anything he had encountered before. If he trusted the computers and reported an attack, Soviet leaders might prepare a nuclear response. If he ignored the warning and the missiles were real, he could be responsible for the destruction of his own country. Either decision carried consequences beyond imagination. Meanwhile, the clock continued ticking. The missiles, if they existed, were moving closer every second. Petrov knew he had only minutes left. He began reviewing every piece of information available. The satellites claimed to see missile launches, but there was still no confirmation from ground radar. No secondary verification, nothing beyond the satellite data. That bothered him. Military systems are designed with redundancy for a reason. One source of information can fail. Two independent sources are far more reliable. At this moment, Petrov had only one source, and it was a relatively new system. A system that had never faced a real nuclear attack before. He remembered concerns that had been raised during training. The technology was advanced, but not perfect. No technology was perfect. Computers could make mistakes. Sensors could malfunction. Unexpected environmental conditions could interfere with observations. The possibility of an error could not be ignored. Around him, other officers continued their work. Some expected him to follow protocol immediately. Others appeared frozen by uncertainty. No one truly knew what was happening, and that uncertainty was terrifying. Outside the bunker, the world remained completely unaware. Millions of Americans slept peacefully. Families watched late-night television. Truck drivers crossed highways. Police officers patrolled quiet neighborhoods. Children dreamed in their beds. None of them knew that a Soviet officer was deciding whether their world would still exist by sunrise. Petrov took a deep breath. Then he made a decision. Instead of reporting a confirmed nuclear attack, he reported the warning as a possible false alarm. It was a stunning choice, an incredibly risky choice, and one that directly contradicted what many expected him to do. In effect, Petrov was betting his own career and perhaps his life on his. If he was wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Soviet Union could be struck without warning. Entire cities could vanish. Millions could die. Yet despite all of that, he trusted his instincts. He trusted his understanding of military strategy. And he trusted his belief that the data simply didn't make sense. Now there was only one thing left to do. Wait. And waiting turned out to be the hardest part. The next several minutes felt like hours. Every person in the command center knew that if the missiles were real, confirmation would arrive soon. Radar systems would detect them. Additional warnings would appear. Evidence would become undeniable. Until then, nobody could know for certain. Petrov sat in silence, watching, waiting, listening, wondering whether he had just saved the world or doomed it. And as the seconds passed, the tension inside that bunker became almost. The waiting began. For Stanislav Petrov, those next few minutes would become the longest of his. Inside the command center, nobody spoke unless absolutely necessary. The alarms had quieted, but the tension remained. Every person in the room understood what was at stake. If the warning was real, nuclear missiles were already racing across the globe. There was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The only question was whether the Soviet Union would launch its own weapons before impact. Petrov sat staring at the screens. The glowing monitors continued displaying the same horrifying message. The system still insisted that the United States had launched nuclear missiles. The data had not changed. The satellites remained convinced. And yet Petrov refused to trust them. His decision had already been made. He had reported the alert as suspicious, potentially false. Now all he could do was wait for evidence. But waiting was torture. Every second felt heavier than the last. The silence inside the bunker became oppressive. Officers checked instruments. Technicians monitored incoming data. Everyone knew what they were looking for. Confirmation. If American missiles had truly been launched, Soviet radar stations would soon detect them independently. Unlike the satellites, radar could physically track incoming objects. Radar would provide the proof everyone needed. But there was a problem. The missiles, if they existed, were still too far away. The radar systems could not yet see them. So the command center remained trapped in uncertainty. Petrov later recalled feeling completely alone. Even though dozens of people surrounded him, The responsibility rested on his shoulders. If history judged the decision, it would judge him. Not the computers, not the satellites, not the officers around him. Him. As the minutes passed, another thought crept into his mind. What if this wasn't a technical error? What if it was something worse? What if the United States had discovered a new strategy? What if this small launch was only the beginning? What if hundreds more missiles were about to follow? The possibility couldn't be ignored. The Cold War had trained leaders on both sides to expect deception. Neither superpower trusted the other. Every move was analyzed. Every military exercise raised suspicion. Every technological advancement created new fears. Just weeks earlier, tensions between Washington and Moscow had reached levels. The Soviet leadership genuinely feared the possibility of a surprise attack. Some officials believed the United States might attempt to cripple the Soviet Union before it could respond. That fear hung over everything, including this moment. Petrov understood that if his superiors believed an attack was underway, they feel pressured to retaliate immediately. The logic of nuclear warfare was brutal. Wait too long, and your missiles might be destroyed before they could launch. Launch too quickly, and you risk destroying the world because of a mistake. There was no perfect answer, only terrible choices. Then came another agonizing minute. Still nothing. No radar confirmation. No additional evidence. No signs of incoming warheads. The bunker remained locked in suspense. Petrov watched the clock. Every passing second slightly improved the chances that he was right. But certainty remained impossible. The officers around him continued their work. Some likely wondered if their commander had made a catastrophic mistake. Others probably hoped he was right. Nobody knew. Outside the facility, dawn was still hours away. Across the Soviet Union, people slept. Across Europe, people slept. Across America, people slept, completely unaware that civilization itself was hanging in the balance. If Petrov's instincts were wrong, millions might soon die without ever knowing what happened. Cities like Moscow, Washington, New York, Leningrad, Chicago, and countless others could disappear in flashes of light brighter than the sun. Entire generations could vanish in a matter of hours. The future of humanity rested on information that might not even be. Then more time passed. Still no radar confirmation. Still no incoming missiles. Still no evidence beyond the satellites. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, hope began to grow. Petrov remained cautious. He knew it was too early to celebrate. But with every passing minute, the possibility of a false alarm became more. The tension inside the room remained unbearable. Yet something was changing. The nightmare scenario that had seemed certain only minutes earlier was beginning to crack. And soon, the truth behind the mysterious warning would finally start to reveal itself. Minute after minute passed, and still nothing appeared on Soviet radar. For Stanislav Petrov, this was the first sign that his instincts might have been right. If 5 American nuclear missiles had truly been launched, the radar network have begun detecting them by now. Yet the screens remained silent. No incoming warheads, no additional confirmations. No evidence that an attack was actually taking place. Inside the command center, the atmosphere slowly began to change. The panic had not disappeared. No one was celebrating. No one was relaxing. But uncertainty was beginning to replace fear. The officers continued watching their instruments. The technicians continued reviewing data. Everyone searched for an explanation. How could the satellite system be so certain while the radar system saw? The contradiction made no sense. And the longer it continued, the more troubling it became. Petrov remained focused. He understood that history often looks simple in hindsight. People imagined that once he decided the warning was false, everything became easy. That wasn't true. At the time, he still had no proof. He was operating on intuition, experience, logic, and a feeling that something was wrong. The truth could still go either way. Then another critical moment arrived. The estimated time for the missiles to begin appearing on radar passed. Still nothing. The screens remained clear. No incoming targets, no signs of a nuclear strike. For the first time, Petrov allowed himself to believe that the alert might truly be false. But that realization brought a different concern. If the attack wasn't real, what had caused the warning? How could one of the Soviet Union's most advanced military systems make such a dangerous mistake? The answer would not emerge immediately. Investigators would spend months examining what happened. But eventually they discovered something astonishing. The satellites had been fooled. High above Earth, the positioning of the sun, the clouds, and the satellites had combined in an extremely unusual way. Sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds. The sensors interpreted those reflections as missile launches. In other words, the system had mistaken sunlight for nuclear war. One of the most sophisticated military warning networks ever created had nearly triggered a global catastrophe because of a rare optical illusion. The discovery shocked Soviet officials. The entire purpose of the system was to prevent surprise attacks. Instead, it had nearly created one. Had a different officer been on duty that night, events might have unfolded very differently. A commander who followed protocol without hesitation could have reported a confirmed American attack. That report would have moved rapidly through the Soviet chain of command. Senior military leaders would have been forced to make decisions under extraordinary pressure. Would they have launched a retaliatory strike? Nobody knows. Historians still debate that question today. Some believe additional verification procedures would have prevented a launch. Others argue that the atmosphere of fear during the Cold War made escalation dangerously possible. What everyone agrees on is this: the situation was far more dangerous than most people realized, and Stanislav Petrov stood directly in the middle of it. Ironically, despite his actions, Petrov was not immediately celebrated. In fact, many Soviet officials were uncomfortable discussing the incident. Acknowledging the false alarm meant acknowledging flaws in a highly classified military system. It meant admitting that a technological failure had nearly produced disastrous consequences. For years, the event remained largely unknown to the public. Petrov returned to his normal duties. The world moved on. Most people never learned how close they may have come to disaster, but inside the Soviet military, the lessons were impossible to ignore. The warning system required improvements. Procedures needed review. Technology alone could not be trusted completely. Human judgment still mattered. And on one extraordinary night in September 1983, human judgment had proven reliable than the machines. Yet the story was far from over, because as investigators examined what happened, a larger and more disturbing question began to emerge. If one false alarm could nearly trigger a crisis, how many other close calls had occurred during the Cold War? And how many of them had remained hidden from public view? The answers would reveal a reality even more frightening than anyone imagined. For years, almost nobody outside the Soviet military knew what had happened on night of September 26, 1983. There were no newspaper headlines, no television interviews, no public celebrations, no medals presented before cheering crowds. The incident remained buried inside classified reports and military archives, and Stanislav Petrov returned to his normal life. In fact, many Soviet officials preferred not to discuss the event at all. From their perspective, the false alarm exposed an embarrassing reality. One of the Soviet Union's most advanced military systems had failed. Not just failed, it had nearly created one of the greatest disasters in human history. Acknowledging that publicly was not something military leaders were eager to. As a result, Petrov's actions remained largely unknown for years. The world continued spinning. The Cold War continued, and millions of people never realized how close they may have come to catastrophe. But eventually, details began to emerge. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, information that had once been tightly controlled started reaching historians, journalists, and researchers. Former military officials spoke more openly. Documents became available, and little by little, the story of Stanislav Petrov reached the outside. The reaction was immediate. Many people were stunned. Some journalists called him the man who saved the world. Others described him as the officer who prevented World War III. While historians debate exactly how close the world came to nuclear war that night, few deny that Petrov faced an extraordinary decision. And that decision may have altered the course of history. Yet what shocked many researchers even more was discovering that Petrov's was not unique. As more Cold War records became available, historians uncovered a disturbing pattern. Again and again, the world had come frighteningly close to nuclear disaster, not because leaders wanted war, not because missiles were intentionally launched, but because of mistakes, misunderstandings, human errors, technical failures, and simple bad luck. One of the most famous examples occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. At the time, the United States and Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. American ships surrounded Cuba. Soviet forces prepared for conflict. Military commanders on both sides expected fighting to begin at any moment. During that crisis, a Soviet submarine named B-59 found itself under pressure. The crew had lost communication with Moscow. American naval forces were dropping practice depth charges nearby. The Soviet sailors had no idea whether war had already begun. Inside the submarine was a nuclear torpedo, a weapon powerful enough to devastate an entire fleet. Some officers aboard believed they should launch it. Tensions rose. Arguments erupted. The situation became increasingly dangerous. But one man refused to approve the launch. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. Without his agreement, the torpedo could not be fired. Arkhipov said no. Historians now believe that decision may have prevented a catastrophic escalation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The similarities to Petrov's story are striking. Two different men, two different decades, two different crises, yet both faced situations where fear, uncertainty, and military pressure could produce unimaginable consequences, and both chose restraint. As researchers continued examining Cold War records, more incidents emerged. Computer errors, radar malfunctions, training tapes accidentally inserted into operational systems, misidentified aircraft, false warnings. The deeper historians looked, the more unsettling the picture became. The survival of civilization had often depended on individuals making calm decisions under extreme pressure. Not superheroes, not politicians, not famous generals. Ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And among those people, Stanislav Petrov became one of the most remarkable because, unlike many others, he openly questioned the technology in front of him. He trusted logic over panic, judgment over procedure, and in doing so, he demonstrated something that remains important even today. Technology can be powerful. Technology can be sophisticated. Technology can save lives. But technology can also make mistakes. And sometimes the most important safeguard is the human being sitting. Machine. By the early 2000s, Petrov's story had become known around the world. Documentaries were produced. Books were written. Awards were presented. The once obscure Soviet officer became an international symbol of calm, decision-making under pressure. Yet despite all the recognition, Petrov himself often seemed uncomfortable being called a hero. He repeatedly insisted that he had simply done his job, but many historians disagree. Because on that September night in 1983, doing his job would have meant trusting the computer. Instead, he trusted his own judgment, and the consequences of that decision may have reached far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the years passed, Stanislav Petrov returned to what many would consider an ordinary life. There were no grand celebrations waiting for him, no national recognition, no headlines declaring him a hero. In fact, the Soviet Union had little interest in drawing attention to what had happened that night. The reason was simple. The incident was embarrassing. Military leaders did not want the world, or even many people inside their own government, to know that a false alarm had nearly triggered a nuclear crisis. Admitting the mistake would mean admitting weaknesses in one of their most advanced defense systems. So the event remained largely hidden. Petrov continued serving for a period of time, but the experience stayed with him. Years later, he would describe the pressure he felt that night. Imagine being responsible for a decision that could determine whether millions lived or died. Imagine knowing that if you made the wrong call, entire nations could vanish. Very few people in human history have ever faced such a burden. Yet Petrov carried that memory for the rest of his life. Ironically, his decision did not immediately improve his military career. Some reports suggest that certain superiors were unhappy with aspects of how the incident had been handled. Others believed procedures should have been followed more strictly. In bureaucracies, people often prefer rules to judgment. Rules create certainty. Judgment introduces risk, and Petrov had relied heavily on his own judgment. Whether that was appreciated depended on who was evaluating his actions. Eventually, he left military service. Life moved on. The Soviet Union itself would eventually collapse. The Cold War would come to an end. The Berlin Wall would fall. Eastern Europe would change forever. The world entered a new era. Yet the story of September 26, 1983 remained buried. For a long time, Petrov lived quietly. Many of his neighbors had no idea what had happened. Many of his friends never heard the full story. To them, he was simply another former military officer. Nothing more. Nothing less. And perhaps that is one of the most remarkable aspects of this story. History often remembers presidents, generals, prime ministers, kings. Yet sometimes the people who have the greatest impact on the world are almost completely unknown. For years, Stanislav Petrov was one of those people. Meanwhile, historians continued studying the Cold War. As more classified information became available, researchers began piecing just how dangerous the period had been. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the picture became. The Cold War was not simply a political rivalry. It was a constant balancing act between peace and catastrophe. Both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization many times over. At various points, each side feared the other might attack first. That fear influenced military planning, intelligence gathering, diplomatic decisions, and defense systems. The early warning network Petrov monitored was part of that environment. The system existed because Soviet leaders feared surprise attacks. American systems existed for the same reason. Each side watched the other constantly. Satellites monitored missile fields, radar tracked aircraft, submarines patrolled oceans, spies gathered intelligence. The goal was deterrence, but deterrence created its own dangers. The faster leaders needed to react, the less time they had to verify information. And the less time available for verification, the greater the risk of... Petrov understood this reality better than almost anyone. On that September night, he had witnessed firsthand how fragile the situation truly was. One false signal, one incorrect assumption, one decision made under pressure. That was all it could take. Years later, when journalists finally began interviewing him, many expected dramatic stories. Many expected him to describe himself as a hero. Instead, they often found a modest man who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Again and again, Petrov insisted that he had simply done what he believed was. But perhaps that humility is exactly why his story continues to resonate. Because when people imagine someone saving the world, they often picture extraordinary individuals performing extraordinary acts. Petrov's story is different. He wasn't trying to become famous. He wasn't trying to make history. He wasn't seeking recognition. He was simply trying to make the correct decision in an impossible situation. And in doing so, he may have changed the course of human history forever. Yet even as the world slowly learned his name, another question continued to haunt historians. How close had humanity actually come to disaster that night? Was Petrov truly the last barrier between peace and nuclear war? Or were there additional safeguards that would have prevented catastrophe? The answer remains one of the most fascinating debates of the entire Cold. One of the most debated questions surrounding Stanislav Petrov's story is most terrifying. What would have happened if he had followed protocol? What if, instead of questioning the warning, he had immediately reported a confirmed American nuclear attack? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. History never got the chance to find out. But military historians have spent decades examining the possibilities, and many of them agree on one thing. The situation was far more dangerous than most people realize. To understand why, we need to remember the atmosphere of September 1983. This was not a time of trust between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was one of the darkest periods of the Cold War. Only weeks earlier, Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007. The incident had shocked the world. Relations between Washington and Moscow had deteriorated rapidly. Political leaders on both sides viewed each other with extreme suspicion. Soviet intelligence agencies were actively searching for signs that the United States might be preparing a surprise attack. Some Soviet officials genuinely believed such an attack was possible. That fear influenced military planning at every level. In that environment, a warning of incoming American missiles would have been taken very seriously. Had Petrov reported the alert as a confirmed attack, the information would moved rapidly through the Soviet chain of command. Military commanders would have been notified. Defense officials would have been notified. Political leaders would have been notified. Each level of leadership would have faced the same terrifying problem. There would be very little time available. Intercontinental ballistic missiles travel incredibly fast. Leaders cannot spend hours debating. They often have only minutes, and under those conditions, every second matters. Some analysts believe additional verification procedures would eventually reveal the mistake. Ground radar systems still showed no incoming missiles. Other intelligence sources might have raised doubts. Additional officers might have questioned the data. Those safeguards existed for a reason. But other historians are less confident. They point out that fear can influence decision-making. especially when leaders believe they are under attack, especially when they have only minutes to respond. Imagine being told that enemy nuclear missiles are already on their way. Imagine believing that your country may cease to exist within the hour. How rational would decision-making remain? How carefully would every piece of information be analyzed? Nobody can answer those questions with certainty, because no government has ever faced that exact situation, fortunately. But the possibility alone is unsettling. During the Cold War, military planners on both sides understood that false warnings represented one of the greatest dangers of the nuclear age, not because machines were malicious, not because leaders wanted war, but because humans are imperfect. Technology is imperfect, and pressure can lead to mistakes. Petrov's decision interrupted that process. By labeling the alert as suspicious rather than confirmed, he introduced something critically important. Time. Time to think. Time to verify. Time to question. Time to avoid panic. And in nuclear crises, time may be the most valuable resource of all. Many experts believe this was the true significance of his decision. He did not necessarily save the world by himself. History is rarely that simple. But he slowed down a process that could have become extremely dangerous. He created space for evidence to emerge. And once the evidence emerged, the truth became obvious. There were no missiles. There was no attack. There was only a malfunction, a mistake, an illusion created by sunlight reflecting off clouds. Yet that explanation arrived only because someone was willing to question the initial warning. Someone was willing to challenge the machine. And that someone was Stanislav Petrov. Perhaps the most chilling part of this story is realizing how ordinary the beginning seemed. No explosions, no dramatic confrontations, no armies crossing borders, just a computer screen, a warning message, and a man trying to decide whether to trust what he was seeing. History often focuses on battles, on wars, on leaders, but sometimes the fate of nations turns on a single decision made in a quiet room by a person almost nobody has ever heard of. And in September 1983, that quiet room may have become one of the most important places on Earth, because inside it sat a man who refused to panic, a man who refused to assume the worst, and a man who understood that sometimes the most dangerous words in the world are, "The computer says so." By the time dawn approached, the immediate danger had passed. The missiles never appeared. The attack never came. The world continued turning. Most people woke up unaware that anything unusual had happened. Yet the lessons of that night would remain relevant long after the Cold War ended. Lessons about technology, lessons about judgment, and lessons about the extraordinary importance of keeping calm when everyone expects panic. For most of the world, September 26, 1983 passed like any other day. People went to work. Children went to school. Governments continued operating. Life moved forward. Almost nobody realized how extraordinary the previous night had been. And for many years, the name Stanislav Petrov remained virtually unknown. That anonymity is one of the strangest parts of the story. If a soldier performs a heroic act on a battlefield, there are often witnesses. If a pilot completes a dangerous mission, there are records. If a political leader makes a historic decision, the world usually hears about. But Petrov's most important moment happened inside a secret military, behind closed doors, surrounded by classified information. As a result, his actions remained hidden from public view. Years turned into decades. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall became history. The world entered a new era. Yet the story of the man who questioned the warning system remained buried. Eventually, however, information began to emerge. Former Soviet officials started speaking publicly. Journalists began investigating. Researchers examined records that had once been inaccessible. And slowly the story reached the outside world. When people learned what had happened, many were stunned. The idea that a single military officer had faced such an enormous decision seemed almost unbelievable. The media quickly became fascinated. Newspapers published articles. Television programs covered the incident. Historians debated its significance. And gradually, Stanislav Petrov became known around the world. Many people began referring to him as the man who saved the world. It was a dramatic title, perhaps even an exaggerated one. Petrov himself never seemed entirely comfortable with it. He often insisted that he had simply done his job. But many observers disagreed. After all, doing his job according to strict protocol might have meant reporting the alert as a confirmed attack. Instead, he chose to think independently. He chose to question the evidence, and that choice may have prevented an extremely dangerous chain of events. As international attention grew, organizations began honoring him. Petrov received awards recognizing his contribution to global peace. He was invited to events, interviewed by journalists, celebrated by people who viewed him as a symbol of reason and restraint. One award ceremony described him as a man who helped prevent a potential nuclear catastrophe. Another praised his courage in trusting his judgment under extraordinary pressure. For someone who had spent years living quietly, the attention was unexpected. Yet despite the recognition, Petrov remained remarkably humble. Those who met him often described him as thoughtful, modest, and somewhat uncomfortable with being treated as a hero. He rarely portrayed himself as someone extraordinary. Instead, he emphasized the circumstances, the uncertainty, the responsibility, and the difficult decisions faced by countless military personnel during the war. Perhaps that humility explains why his story resonates with so many people. Petrov wasn't a famous politician. He wasn't a powerful general. He wasn't a celebrity. He was an officer doing a difficult job in a dangerous era. And when confronted with a decision that could affect millions of lives, he remained calm. That lesson remains relevant today. Modern technology is far more advanced than the systems of 1983. Computers are faster. Satellites are more sophisticated. Communication networks are more reliable. Yet one reality has never changed. Technology can still fail. Systems can still produce errors. Information can still be incomplete. And sometimes, human judgment remains the most important safeguard of all. This is one reason Petrov's story continues to be studied by military, historians, and policymakers around the world. It serves as a reminder that critical decisions should never be surrendered entirely to machines. No matter how advanced the technology becomes, no matter how confident the system appears, someone must still be willing to ask a simple question. What if the computer is wrong? That question changed history in 1983, and decades later it remains just as important. As the years passed, Petrov became an unexpected symbol of something larger than the Cold War itself. Not simply peace, not simply survival, but the value of independent thinking, the willingness to remain calm when fear demands action, the willingness to question assumptions when everyone else accepts them, and the courage to trust your judgment when the stakes could not possibly be. By the time the world finally learned his story, the crisis itself had become history. But its lessons were timeless, because the events of that night were never really about missiles. They were about decisions, and few decisions have ever carried greater consequences. As we look back on the events of September 26, 1983, it's tempting to focus on the technology, the satellites, the computers, the warning systems, the military procedures. But in reality, this story was never truly about machines. It was about a human being, one man sitting in a room full of flashing lights and screaming alarms, one man being told by sophisticated computers that nuclear war had begun, one man facing pressure that most of us can barely imagine, and one man choosing to think for himself. Stanislav Petrov wasn't a president. He wasn't a general commanding armies. He wasn't a famous political leader whose name appeared in history books. He was simply an officer doing his job. Yet on that night, his judgment may have mattered more than the decisions of presidents and prime ministers, because while governments built weapons, while scientists built warning systems, while politicians debated strategy, Petrov was the person who had to make a choice with almost unimaginable consequences. History is often shaped by great battles. Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, Gettysburg. But sometimes history changes in complete silence. No gunfire, no explosions, no cheering crowds, just a single decision made in a quiet room. And perhaps that's why Petrov's story remains so powerful today. It reminds us that courage doesn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes courage means remaining calm when everyone around you is afraid. Sometimes courage means questioning what others accept without hesitation. And sometimes courage means refusing to act until you're certain the facts are on your side. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union disappeared. The Berlin Wall fell. Many of the fears that dominated the 20th century became part of history. But the lessons of that night remain relevant, because technology continues to shape our world. Artificial intelligence, automated systems, advanced military networks, complex computer programs. Every year, machines become more powerful, more sophisticated, more capable. Yet Petrov's story reminds us of something important. No matter how advanced technology becomes, human judgment still matters. Common sense still matters. Critical thinking still matters. And sometimes, the most important decision is the decision to pause, to think, and to ask whether the machine could be wrong. Stanislav Petrov passed away in 2017. For much of his life, he remained relatively unknown. Yet his story continues to inspire people around the world. Not because he sought recognition, not because he wanted fame, but because when confronted with an impossible situation, he chose reason over. And in doing so, he became a symbol of something larger than himself. A reminder that history is not only shaped by powerful leaders. Sometimes it is shaped by ordinary people who make extraordinary decisions when it matters most. And perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson of all. On one September night in 1983, while most of the world slept peacefully, one man trusted his instincts. One man questioned the evidence. One man refused to panic. And because he did, the world woke up the next morning exactly as it had the day before. Most people never knew how close they may have come to disaster. But history remembers, and now so do we. Thank you for watching War Stories Daily. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. Do you think you would have made the same decision as Stanislav Petrov? Would you have trusted the computer, or would you have trusted your instincts? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy real war stories, forgotten heroes, Cold War mysteries, and moments that changed history forever, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Because here at War Stories Daily, we bring history to life, one unforgettable at a time. Until next time, thank you for watching.